Okay, good afternoon. I think we're ready to begin. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel, which is co-sponsored by WAN IFRA's Women in News program. My name is Fatemah Farag. I am the Regional Director for the Women in News program in the MENA region. It's my pleasure to introduce my co-panelists today. To my far right, we have Dalal Saoud. Dalal Saoud is a veteran Lebanese journalist with over 20 years of experience working with UPI, including the position of Middle East Bureau Chief there. She also worked for 2 years as a media director at the American University in Beirut, and finally set up the London-based Arab Weekly and also managed that publication. Dalal also works with the Women in News program as a coach for our Lebanese participants. On my left, and if you have a copy of the print program, you might think this is Vincent, but it isn't. It is Myra. We should have had Vincent Kahaya from Zambia. Unfortunately, he was unable to make it today, but we're very lucky to have with us Myra Abdallah, who is our program manager for the WIN program, and will be representing the program and its African component. Hi, Myra. And then on my right, my colleague and friend, Lina El Wardani, who is a veteran Egyptian journalist and has been through the WIN program, currently runs the travel section at Ahram Online, which is the state-run largest newspaper in Egypt, and has previous experience working with the BBC, with the Al-Masri Al-Yawm as managing editor, and other publications. So, without further ado, let us begin. A short introduction before we begin with our panelists. If you look at the program here, you'll find that the number of panels that deal with gender, that deal with sexual harassment, that deal with the issue of the position of women journalists and their work are quite a few. And this is really a very different landscape than what we would have seen several years ago when you had a panel on gender or on a women-specific panel. This would be something that was token, that was sort of on the side, that was sort of added to make it look good. The same also if you look at media development, the number of programs that deal with gender parity and gender equality and these conditions of work of women in newsrooms has increased to a great extent, and this is really showing a better awareness around the need for better standards and better conditions of work for women in the profession. A lot of this work is directed at the less developed parts of the world, the Middle East and Africa not being exceptions. However, when we look at the current situation at the media industry across the world, we will find that actually the situation of women probably is not much better than that in the Middle East or in Africa. A few figures, even looking beyond strict journalism, if you look at the cinema industry, you'll find that in the US, women representation of lead roles is less than 17%, that men speak 3 times more than women in mainstream movies. If you look at the advertising industry, you'll find that women only speak 20% of the time, and the rest is all dedicated to men. That is not even bringing up the issue of stereotyping. And in terms of newsrooms, it is not much different. You'll find the representation of women in content to be less than 20% across the board. Women as sources, sometimes as low as 5%, even on issues that directly relate to women, such as reproductive health. And women in positions of seniority, decision-making positions, are very hard to find. Discrepancies in pay. We're talking about large newsrooms in the West, not someplace else that is remote. Me Too is really leveling and sort of the playing field and showing that the conditions of work of women is quite primitive in many parts of the world. So what we're hoping to show you today is the systemic approach that the Women in News program has adopted 3 years ago in dealing with improving gender parity within the newsrooms of selected news organizations, partner organizations in the Middle East and in Africa. And what we hope to show you by the end of this session is that the experiences of our participants and of the work that's being done show that there is also something to be learned, something positive to be learned that can be introduced to the general and sort of international narrative around improving women's position in news. So I open up the first round sort of question, begin with you, Dalal, around how different and how similar really are conditions in the Middle East for working women in media.
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. I would like to start to say that the number of women studying journalism and working in the media in the Arab world is definitely increasing. And yet they remain a minority in top journalistic roles. In most of the Arab countries, you can see more and more women working in the newsroom as reporters, even economic analysts, political commentators, columnists, and even sports anchors, with few venturing into photography. Most importantly, the many wars in the region, starting with the Lebanese civil war in the mid-1970s, and the repeated Israeli attacks on Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, Iraq wars, and all the violence that engulfed the Arab Spring countries, were an opportunity for daring women journalists becoming war correspondents, and they proved themselves. I would also note that the Arab TV booms that started in the 1990s with Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, that spread like mushrooms with the Arab Spring developments, attracted more Arab women to this profession. However, journalism is changing, as is the role of women in the workplace. And according to a study by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, women substantially outnumber men in journalism training and enter the profession in slightly greater numbers. But still today, relatively few are rising to senior jobs, and the pay gap between male and female journalists remains a stubbornly wide one. But the same is true across many Western countries. I would like to also note that, to a certain extent, working in an international media institutions provided an opportunity for a number of Arab women journalists to advance and reach senior positions as bureau chiefs, senior correspondents, and there are a number of good examples in that regard. But they are fully aware that's the maximum level they can reach. It's that within the Western media, and Western women journalists are themselves struggling for gender equality, equal pay, and right for top positions like editor-in-chief. In the Arab world, there are still enduring stereotypes. Women predominate on the lifestyle pages, but it's shifting, and things are changing a little bit. The main problem, I think, it's women's inequality in the Arab world. It's associated with culture in our societies. But there are a lot of efforts being done by women journalists. They are practicing and facing a lot of problems also to get to somewhere to be equal with men in our newsroom. This is an introduction that I would like later on to expand on that if you want, Fatemah.
You're saying that this is really predominantly about culture, or is it also related to the way the media industry is run also in the Middle East?
Of course, but there is a difference. I think it's a culture, it's a certain mentality that we are breaking as women in the Arab world. Being as war correspondents in the fields and covering wars, it has changed. People are got used to see women. But there are few, there are not many, they are growing in numbers. The situation in the Middle East, they have proved or forced women and give them an opportunity to be there. They were brave enough to do it. So you can see them in the street. It's no more like, it's strange to people. They accept them more, okay? And this is also differ between Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, for example, to other countries, Tunisia too. But in the Gulf, you can see that. But there are lots of efforts in that regard. But it's still limited. You all know the business, the media business also is suffering these days. And I would like to talk about that later on. Because of the financial problems that we are facing, especially after the Arab Spring, the financial crisis in 2008, it's all affected that.
Thank you, Dalal. Lina, staying within the Middle East, and you're someone who has also done a lot of work as a reporter in conflict zones and covering wars and gone out and done the job. When you go back to the newsroom, have you seen that recognized in how you were handled?
Well, yes, as Dalal just said, yes, it's accepted now, and it's seen as normal that you see women on the field as war reporters and in conflict zones, and the resistance is not coming from a gender perspective now. Like, I remember when I first wanted to go to the conflict zone for the first time in Yemen, and my boss didn't say anything about me being a woman. He said, but did you refresh your hostile environment training? And I said, no, it's up, but no one else has in the newsroom. Like, we're all the same. I mean, it has been 3 years since we've all been trained for the hostile environment. But I insisted and I went. But the problem here is the patronizing tone that we get, especially from our colleagues, in the West. Like, I used to work for BBC in Cairo and my colleagues in London, and it's everywhere. Like, they want to see this cute lady with a headscarf going and covering war zones as if, it's an alien, as if women and men are not equal, as if, it's something really fancy, something really cool, orientalist. And I really don't like this assumption and this image and I don't like to be put in a position where I have to prove something. I like to start from a place where we're all equal in the newsroom.
So sometimes the equality is not really stemming from within the Arab newsroom itself, but comes from external stereotyping?
No, definitely.
And this is something that you felt?
Yeah.
Let's get an Africa perspective. What is the situation in the countries within which you are covering?
Well, there are many similarities between Africa and the Middle East. The first similarity is that there are women journalists outnumber men journalists, but there are very few women on managerial and top management positions within media organizations. And this is caused by many reasons. One of them is the lack of gender policies within the media organizations, despite the SADC protocol that encourages the 50-50 gender parity within media organizations. And also there is a very conservative society when it comes to speaking up and women speaking up. Sexual harassment is an issue that is used to intimidate women journalists in Africa. For example, like the Me Too campaign was very successful because it helped women speak up. In Africa, this is not always the solution, because very few women dare to speak up because of the conservatism in the society, because they sometimes get blacklisted. For example, they get less chances of being hired in media organizations if they say they were victim of sexual harassment. And this is why there is this fear always associated with speaking up, and this is why sexual harassment is being used as a very powerful tool to intimidate women journalists, definitely combined with a list of social contexts that we can go into in a bit.
It's very interesting. This idea of Me Too has really changed the narrative to a great extent in the West. I'd really like to get your viewpoints on whether this has impacted work in the Middle East. When you talk to media executives in the Middle East, they will tell you there is no sexual harassment in the newsroom, and that it might happen occasionally with sources, but not, and the solution, of course, is not to allow women reporters to deal with sources that might harass them, as opposed to correcting the issue itself. So from your experience working, is it an issue that needs to be dealt with within the Middle East, and has the Me Too campaign impacted the way people handle it?
Is it an issue? Yes, it's an issue. It's a huge one. And yes, it's one of the main challenges. But how far has the Me Too impacted the situation? Yes, it made women speak up more. We've seen many reports in Egypt. Nothing has gone to court. Some has gone public. And I remember this, it was a Facebook post I will never forget, from a famous human rights lawyer, saying that, if women keep on doing this, we will have difficulty hiring them in human rights organizations. You can't claim any sexual harassment unless you have evidence. And when you have evidence, you go to court. You don't go to the press. So there is this. And in the newsroom, we had many debates on whether we can publish or not. And we decided against it because we don't want to be sensationalist, and we don't want to be seen as nurturing into one side or another, and we don't want to go into this because there was a huge scandal in Egypt for one of the presidential elections, and we didn't want to go into that, or it was the editor-in-chief's call. But yeah, but it's a big sign that, you know, we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. I mean, if even in our newsroom, which is considered a little more liberal than many others, we couldn't reach this decision. I don't know about others. What will the others do?
We have a long way to go. I think we can probably all agree on that. And that really brings me to the point of how is it that we can make an impact, and relating issues of gender to the crisis within the media industry within these regions. Is there a link between both, and is this an approach that can create sort of positive results? Dalal.
Yes, yes, I think so, but there are lots of efforts to be done here. You know, it depends. I will speak about myself, my experience, because I was running a newsroom. I was the editor-in-chief at a certain point for the UPI, United Press International. I was running the news and the whole operation. And, you know, hiring people at that moment, I didn't have any discrimination. Whoever was fit, whether woman or man, journalists who were applied equal opportunity in applying and being hired in that regard. We tried, you know, we faced lots of problems because covering wars also, being in states of war all the time, there are lots of pressure and obstacles, and having women and men journalists in the same room, you need to let them understand that they are equal in that regard, that they need to do the job whether you are a woman or a man. It creates certain familiarity also among them and a teamwork. So you need to do a teamwork and at the same time explain to them what are the limits between respecting each other, avoid sexual harassment in that regard. So there were lots of challenges. Okay, I think I started with the backup of my directors in Washington at that time, and I do remember when one of them was in Beirut and we were moving the operation from London to Beirut at that time, and he was with me while interviewing some candidates, and he simply told one of the candidates, "Do you have a problem with women being your boss?" And he was looking like that. He said, "Because if you are a problem, stop here, go, because she will be your boss." This was a message. It was a good support from them. And I do think that at that time, it depends on your qualifications with them. If you are good enough, I was able to reach that position and worked hard to reach that position with the backup. The problem, I haven't worked with local newspapers or media institutions in the Arab world, but I know a lot about that. And especially, I heard a lot when I'm coaching the participants of the WIN program. And it's interesting to listen to them and so they can speak it up. And we will go into more details after if you want. In that regard, it's so hard to give equal chance and opportunities and for everyone, but it's by practice that you do that, okay, in the room, and you make people think about it and deal, especially the men journalists with us. You're no better, you know. I don't differentiate. If you are good, you could be a woman or a man. If you are good enough for the job, and I had lots of examples of really women journalists working hard, and they have the brain, you know, because the stereotype said that you're as good as being in the woman magazine, not in politics. Now things are changing, but you know, there are women in the Arab world, women journalists, they are doing lots of efforts in that regard. They are fighting lots of stereotypes, the mentality, and you know, fighting for their own rights, which are due. So this is a lot for them, making some progress at a certain point, but also with the financial problems facing the new media institutions these days, this is not helping at all.
This idea of creating a new work environment and finding a common ground so that people can work together, do you feel that perhaps there is a problem with defining what sexual harassment is within the Middle Eastern context? Is there enough information on which people can develop these ideas? So perhaps also a lack of understanding.
This is a kind of awareness, because you say, oh, how can you define sexual harassment? By saying hello? This sexual harassment by tapping probably your shoulder or by going for. So I think there should be more awareness about what's sexual harassment in the workplace. Okay?
Yeah.
And don't forget, I do remember during the Civil War, we had to stay overnight in the office, men and women journalists, you know, and stepping on each other. And that creates a lot of familiarity at a certain point. How can you divide? How can you make a really a clear definition of what's wrong and right in that regard? But definitely there are lots of intimidation using sexual harassment for that. You said that well in Africa, it's in the Arab world, and with the misconception also, you know, you want to promote in your work, you have a price to pay. And
yeah.
This is, you know, that's bad. You need lots of, to create awareness and to define it properly. It's not just to use the word sexual, and try to deal with, to tell them how to react. And it needs to start with the boss.
This idea of intimidation and using sexual favor and the ability to get away with this type of behavior also as a way to get people to conform with this type of behavior so that they can progress in their work. What do we see happening in the south of the continent around that?
Well, I want to also build on what Dalal said, that the definition of sexual harassment and how this is being used. I think one of the important things that needs to be done is the legalization of sexual harassment. This needs to be included in legal texts. We have in the penal codes articles that deal with rape, that deal with domestic violence, that deal with physical violence, but sexual harassment is not defined, is not even mentioned in the law. That leaves perpetrators free. Especially that sexual harassment is very hard to be proven, and the burden of proof is always on the victim. When there is no physical contact or physical harm, sexual harassment cannot be proven, yet it has a lot of impact on women journalists more specifically. This is from one side, and also the gender policies. For example, in Africa, there is the SADC protocol that encourages the gender equality. For example, in the Middle East, there is WAN IFRA's gender agreement among media organizations. Gender policy within media organizations help women journalists be safe in the work environment, one, and two, have equal chances in advancing.
Lina, let me ask you, in this idea of who you go to and who's intimidating whom, the fact that men are still in power, would you consider that the fact that we don't have enough women in leadership positions is perhaps one of the reasons why we still have an environment where this type of intimidation can happen, and why we don't get better procedures with regards to sexual harassment?
Definitely. But also the penal code in Egypt is quite strong. Sexual harassment could be punished. It's a penalty. It could be punished from 6 months to 3 years in jail. And actually, the penal code depends on, the cultural thing that, that the victim would never report it because it will bring a scandal on herself. So actually, her testimony is enough to prove. But the problem is it's cultural. I mean, only 1% of cases is being reported. The problem is cultural. The problem is who is going to go and drag herself and the offender to court. And if she manages to drag the offender to court, which is very, very difficult, if she manages, then the law is on her side. But the problem is largely cultural. And yes, it's largely because women are rarely in senior positions. And if most of the men's idea of, that women are bringing problems, they get pregnant and they want to go home early, and they might, now with the Me Too campaign, they might actually accuse us of sexual harassment, so it's better not to hire them at all. Also, on the other side, we have from the corporates now a pressure to hire women and to have equal representation. But how do they go about this? We have 10 people qualifying for this job, okay? And I'm in a senior position. I'm interviewing these 10 people. Are those shortlisted? They are 8 men and 2 women. I interview the women. They are not qualified, but I have to hire them because the corporate is telling me that I have to have an equal representation of women and men. actually this is not how I should go about it. What I should go about it is, no, I don't like this selection. Let me see the CVs, and I'm going to choose by myself. I'm going to choose 5 men, 5 women, and I'm going to hire whoever is qualified. So it's,
it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
So getting qualified people into place seems to be part of it. I think for men equally as for women, we probably would agree that many of the people who run the media industry in our regions are not necessarily the best qualified. So perhaps also selection methods and job policies here. But let's take that to what WIN actually does and how we can actually see change, or at least design programs that can actually have an impact in changing the way business is done and ensuring that we do have a qualified pool of people to choose from. Let's begin with Africa this time.
Okay. Before that, one point that was not mentioned was the unconscious bias. Women in managerial position does not necessarily mean that they will be aware of the gender, of the necessity of having gender equality. And this brings me to what WIN does. Women in News is a program that has many components in Africa and in the Middle East that trains women, mid-level managers, on many levels. 1, on the managerial side, and 2, on how to be aware of the necessity of gender equality within media organization. And also there is the Future Leaders that is designed for less experienced journalists, first-year journalism, less than 2-year journalism, that also helps them to see the bigger image within media organizations, and to be aware of all the details and how gender balance can be achieved within media organizations, even before becoming managers, even when they are still in the beginning of their careers, to have this idea built in their head.
Okay.
Speak
well,
about MENA.
Yes, and let's talk, Dalal, you have worked with people who have gone through the program, have gone through the management training, and are back at their newsrooms and trying to actually impact change. What is your experience with that?
Okay. Last year, it was my first experience with being a coach with the Women in News program. It was quite interesting. You know, I got used to train, even in the newsroom. I trained the people at UPI or at the Arab Weekly. I had this function of training exactly, starting from scratch with everyone. The WIN program is very interesting. We got the participant, okay, at a certain, working in Lebanese local media institution, newspapers, TV, website, or something. The good thing about it, it gives them more trust and confidence at a certain point. They can speak up about their problems more frankly. One-to-one coaching is very important, and that's what you introduced in WIN News, because at a certain point, after a few sessions, they feel at ease, and we can talk not only about our profession, how we can do it, how we can advance with the careers, with the problems that they are facing, and the challenges that they are facing within their institutions. And it's a lot, because they feel that they are underpaid, definitely. They are not allowed to go to do certain jobs because she's a woman. She's good enough, because if you don't have a big budget, they can hire a woman with doing the same job probably, but with a lesser pay. She will go, how do we say, not asking too much in certain regard, but they are frustrated. Believe me, they are so frustrated. And even we discuss ways how to confront certain problems within their working environment. Sexual harassment is one part, but even to deal, how she needs to deal with the boss, how she needs to convince him that she's qualified enough and she can do it. There is a whole thing. The WIN program is good enough because of the one-to-one coaching first. It's not just a workshop for 1 or 2 days. It's stretched over months. And I discovered how much they are skillful. They have good ideas and how to improve their skills, which we could help them. And they go to Cairo for certain training also, and they come back with lots of ideas how to do their own projects, how to improve their work inside the institution, their work, or even having their own ideas for like a blog or a website or a certain thing. So in that regard, Fatemah, yes, it's helping. I feel that they become more daring. They speak up about their problems more frankly. They try to learn how to advance, but they know how it's difficult to go and convince, the boss or the director about improving things really. And this, I think, I can now see it because it's limited to all the financial problems that every media institution is facing.
Lina, you've been through the program. You've been through this process of gaining new skills and then having to go back and see what you can do with them. What is that like?
Okay, but my case was different. I was already a news editor at Ahram Online, and before that I was a managing editor. But after the program, I went back, and it was very, very inspiring. But I went back and I decided I don't want to be an editor anymore. I want to have my own thing. And I set up a travel section, and I gave an ultimatum. They needed me for the shifts, for running the news shifts, and I was on the editorial board, but I said, I'm not staying one more day. I'm going to do a travel section. I'm going to travel and write. And this, it was a moment of realization that we live in a culture that puts so much pressure on men and women in so many different ways that there is only one road to success. And this road has to be going this way. By the age of 30, you have to get married, you have to get kids, you have to be a manager, mid-level manager, then senior manager, and and then, I asked myself, am I happy? Am I satisfied? Am I gaining anything new? Have I learned anything new in the past 5 years? Or am I stuck? No, I'm actually stuck. I've been there, I've done it all. I've been a journalist, I covered conflict, I traveled, I had a desk job. I went from being a journalist to being a managing editor, and actually I'm now stuck. I either go in this direction, which everyone is pushing me to go through, or who said that this is that this is success? I want to do something different, and I want to be happy. It doesn't matter if I'm a manager or not. So I did the opposite.
Your own version of it, maybe not necessarily the opposite. Redefining measures of success and how it is that we manage ourselves within these constraints, and accordingly, how do we design programs that should advance women? Do you think that we've seen something that shows us that perhaps we are using preconceived ideas around what success is, about who we should be, and that these need to be redressed?
Well, I think it is important, everything that has been said, training women, giving them confidence, telling them they should not be limited, giving them all the gender policies that help them advance, and but also a very important component, the inclusion of men in the process. And this is one of the new advisory programs of Women in News that is doing the training for women and men within media organizations, because men are also do also need to be aware of the necessity of gender equality, and gender equality can never be achieved without the participation, the active participation of men in the process, and this is something very important. This is what I wanted to add.
Okay, well, agreed for sure, because they are decision makers. But let me also take it to another level. We've touched on the economic, we've touched on the personal level, what women are looking for, but also we cannot really consider these regions without considering the political overstructure, which is really dominating and making decisions as to how the business is run. Dalal, do you think that if we have more women now in senior positions in the Middle East or in Africa, that we would have actually achieved something for freedom of expression, for good journalism? For is this really the end game here? Is it enough to say that we need to have equal representation of women, to have good journalism and representative journalism, not just of women, but exactly. Of all of that represents the truth?
I think the problem that we're facing in the Middle East and the Arab world now is like the profession is like, taking a certain decline. I have lots of, unfortunately, with the political money that is being put to have a newspaper or a TV station or whatever, you're being manipulated. It's like you're limited, whether you are a man or a woman, a journalist in that regard. okay? So you need to follow the editorial line in order to respect the guy who's putting money in these institutions, and that we're losing the professional standard in that regard. Through my discussion with the participants of the WIN program, it's very interesting. You can feel how they are longing for such professional, to regain professional standard, integrity, all the good, you know, what we were taught about journalism in that regard. But going and, in fact, and to their newsroom or to the director or to their boss and supply and providing an article, many times they change it for them. You know, you don't do it, mix it a little bit to make it more in line with the policies. So we have a lot, I think, to work in that regard. Women journalists, as I said, they have been proving themselves more and more in the Arab world, but you know the situation. You can reach a certain level, but up, it's not for you, it's for the man only. And this is a kind of mentality that we're trying to fight, probably by hard work, by proving the good example, okay? You don't have much opportunities, unfortunately, in certain media institutions. As I said, probably because we work with international media organizations, we had a better chance in that regard to reach certain position, and we proved ourselves in that. Lots of women journalists, even, you know, on TV, in Cairo, they are influencers now, and they made a good job in that regard. How we can sustain, that's the question. Always I think about, like, how we can reach a point where you hire someone for his own qualifications, okay, whether a man or a woman. Okay? When I used to do that, I never thought about it. I used to have in my newsroom one with a veil. She was an excellent translator, and then the lady next to her, I heard her, she's like, and they spend the whole time, you know, arguing. She wants to try to convince her to put the veil, and the other one was trying to convince her to take off the veil, okay? And they were remarkably working, but they were good. When I see, you know, the test that they made, I decide upon the test and the personality, whether a man or a woman. But I do confess that being a woman journalist in the Arab world especially, you need to make double efforts, and sometimes it's at the expense of your social life, private life, because you need to always to be present, not to give them the pretext to say that being a woman in the newsroom or on the field, you cannot do it. So unconsciously, you start doing and working double and double and double with less pay. Many times less pay. You know, there is no pay equality in that regard. But this is the battle that we need to continue to fight for, and with the hope that we can change mentality. We are being accepted in the streets and in certain positions where years ago you couldn't dare going there. But a lot needs to be done. My concern now in the Arab world, because of all the political money that is being put, it's either businessmen or the government or political leaders owning the newspapers or the TV stations or whatever. So the room is really, you know, it affects women and men. And at the same time, giving equal opportunity for women. And I always say, is it enough to say we need to have a quota for women in journalism? Is it enough? We need more. We need to convince that, and probably the woman journalist, to prove her qualifications to reach a point. Otherwise, it won't work.
Yeah. Quota. What do you think your response is to a quota? It's always a very contentious topic, this idea that, you know, with numbers we can actually achieve something if we just have the right numbers in place, and that one of the ways of actually implementing this is by, you know, imposing it from above.
I don't think it always works. It works in very, maybe rare times, because we need to set the base before the quota. The quota does not guarantee that women who will be hired will be qualified. Does not guarantee that women who are hired, maybe in managerial positions, will be aware of the gender parity they need to achieve. I don't think it should be, if it has to be implemented, not as a first step. We need to set the base first. We need to do all the training or the awareness and all the, before the quota. It is, sometimes it is important, but More important than that is to focus also on convincing CEOs and media organizations that gender equality is also good for business. And this is, I think this is a good argument to look into, to tell them that it makes sense. There are a lot of case studies that were published, a lot of them published by WAN IFRA, and I think in Winning Strategies handbook. And they speak about how gender equality, and when the media organization started to implement gender equality and gender policy, how the business numbers changed. And I think that makes sense more than the quota. It has more guarantees.
When we look at the ideas that have been put on the table so far, we're talking about cultural change, we're talking about changes in business practice, we're talking about changes in the way politics manages media within these regions and probably within the international context as well. We're talking about the capacity of individual journalists as well. A lot of interlinked yet very, very in and of themselves challenging areas. If we were to talk about a roadmap to create a sustainable impact and change within our media ecosystems within the next 3 years, I'll ask each of you where you would put the emphasis of your work and where you would feel that it was relevant also to the momentum that we've been seeing internationally to improve and create more awareness around these conditions. Dalal.
Yeah, I think about that many times. Whenever you have the chance to have more women in the newsroom, okay, or to accept women journalists. But as I said, I always keep, and my concern is how you can sustain, okay, a newspaper or a TV station or a website under these conditions that we are facing now.
So business practice would come first.
Definitely. You know, my concern is that we need to start from scratch. That's what I'm afraid of. We need to start by focusing on what's journalism, how you write a story, the basics of journalism. We are losing that, especially in that part of our of the world. In our region, we're losing the basics of journalism with the social media. And you know, after the Arab Spring, everybody now, you know, we got rid of those authoritarian regime. Okay, and everybody is expressing himself, like what? We haven't. No, we're back. No. You know, now we are back to point zero. Yeah, I will come to that. But what I'm saying, after the Arab Spring and with the internet, it started even the change, if you want. I mentioned Al Jazeera Al Arabiya and the satellite TV in the 1990s. It started from there because you had more exposure to something that in certain countries you were like Iraq, Syria, and whatever, they were not having access to the international press or to international news. It changed. It started to change from the 1990s. Okay, we reached the point where we have the Arab Spring, and everybody was, you know, delivered of this, get rid of this regimes, oppression and everything, and they started to express themselves, whether on social media or whatever. But we're losing, even as journalists, we're losing the basics of journalism, and this is affecting our credibility and our approach to all the developments in the region. For example, in Syria, can you imagine that we and most of the international press and even local, we were relying on activists. And it was so hard to check whether this is correct, what they are giving us or not. Or you will be limited to the news version of the regime we are giving you. Unfortunately, now, as you said well, now we're back to point zero where you cannot talk anymore in Egypt. And in other countries. So my concern, it's we have bigger problems in that regard, and in the meantime, that's why the ladies and the participants of the WIN program, they came back from Cairo after the training, and I had the impression they said, this is a profession which is dying. I think we have no place, and everybody is trying to think about something else or encourage them again to have their own projects. One, they have on website, they have their own website or blog or something. So it's shifting. Probably because they see within the media institution they are working for that they cannot go beyond that position that they are still, and they are thinking about something, doing something for themselves, and it's scary. But the challenges are big in our profession, in our region.
Starting from scratch is a very interesting idea, especially post-Arab Spring. But I first have to mention that, of course, in Egypt we can speak. This is what we can say. It's the issue, not the right to speak.
And that's what I do.
But it's interesting if you look at least the MENA region, all of the new media sector and a large number of the startups and the sector where there is the most innovation in media development, a large proportion of those people are women, and the leaders of these new innovations are women, and you'll see them on the circuits of these conferences a lot. They're just not acknowledged necessarily within their own media ecosystem, but that exists, and it continues to survive in spite of the relapse that we've seen, and I think that's an indication that really this idea of starting from scratch does open up possibilities, and there's the opportunity for that maybe is much more difficult to deal with when trying to reform within the mainstream. And so maybe an argument for this idea of building outside of that as well. Okay, Lina, what would your takeaway be? Where would the points of emphasis be?
Okay, training, for starters. I think training is very important, and this is why WIN is important, because especially one-to-one training is more influential, because it designs the training to what you want as a journalist, and what works for you in your own working environment, and especially not everything applies to everyone. And yeah, one thing I want to speak about is sourcing. Women representation is not there even in stories, in sources, in the contact lists in our newsrooms. I remember the first job I got was I was a trainee in the first year of university, and I went to this financial newspaper, and they asked me to do a story on the exchange market. So I went to the bourse. They gave me their contact list. I had no gender awareness whatsoever at that time. But something in me told me it's wrong. I mean, how can a contact list of like 300 people be all male names? I mean, what is this? So I decided to go by myself, and I went there, and I found that there are women in the board, and I interviewed them, and I added them to the contact list. And this is something I tell every journalist I hire or I give training to in the newsroom, that don't just stay with the contact list. Go and make your own sources. Go and meet the sources, have coffee with them, and try to balance your stories. We often see this, a story on women representation in, I don't know, the fields, in rice, whatever, and all the sources are men. I mean, we are in a society with 50% men, 50% women. This has to be represented in our stories, in our newsrooms, everywhere, and a real equal representation.
So often the capacity exists, it's just using it.
Exactly, that's how you showcase it.
Myra, final points.
I agree with what Lina said, and this is why gender policies are important, because they don't only deal with organizational level of the media organization, but also with the editorial level. And the gender policies also deal with who are our sources, and some of them maybe can set an inventory for journalists that they can use, an inventory of women's sources they can use for their stories. I think this is one of the important things to do, is to advocate for gender policies and increase awareness about the issue, and also encourage media organizations to work with NGOs who are working on gender issues, because these NGOs have studies, have already a base of principles that media organizations can use. And the second thing is to increase the chances of networking between women. For example, like the leaders of the new media who are women, but they don't really exist in the media ecosystem. When we give them the chance to network, they will be a group, like a powerful group, a pressure group, and this will empower more women to lead media organizations, and also will strengthen the media, the new media organizations themselves to be able to compete with traditional media and already existing powers.
So creating alternative power bases, as well as working on the level of policy. I think that's quite a tall order. Women in News is a program that you can find at this website. We're here for the next few days. If you have any questions about the program or would like to engage with it, we're very happy to take those questions and tell you more about what it is that we do. I'd like to end this with, before I open up the floor to any questions, with a confession. When I was setting up a few panels for this conference, I sent it in to Chris Potter, my recommendations and the lists of panelists that I wanted to bring on board. And he wrote back to me and said to me, don't you realize that all of the ones that you have put forward are men of a certain age? And I was mortified because obviously it's not what I meant. But the point is really that old habits die hard, and it takes a lot of effort to change them and be consciously aware of the fact that sometimes we don't always do business the way we think we would like to do business. And so we hope that we can change that with your efforts. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, we have a few more minutes. Do we have a microphone?
Thank you. Because we are a minority here, we are 2 men, I think.
You're in a minority.
A minority?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the session is success. But I have some ideas. Why women want to go to newsroom? Because why you didn't think that you must destroy the idea of newsroom? The newsroom is designed as to, not as, to present the patriarch regime. Why you want to rebuild the patriarch regime in news? In Egypt, as some of you know, say when they try to praise woman, that is, she is equal, she is worth 100 of men. You want to be a man, or you want to be in fair system? There is no. I work in my beginning in magazine called Rosa Yusuf. It belongs to women who published this magazine in 1940. This regime is repelled itself to be patriarch every time. If we want to change, we must think to destroy this patriarch mentality. I think I want to add something because we present the minority here. Thank you.
Thank you. Disruption, the fact that we need to disrupt and that we need to overhaul structures that continue to reproduce the same forms of oppression and patriarchy. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, especially in Egypt. Yes, it's a very valid point. I mean, do we want? It's a dying profession, and in an oppressive system. And everyone who writes actually or do the job, like your simple job of reporting on a story, puts you at risk of being jailed, murdered, disappeared, or what, you name it. Or you fit into this oppressive system, oppressive patriarchal system that is going from top downwards. This is how journalism works. And it's now not journalism, it's you're being the state's mouthpiece, actually. And it's an oppressive system for both men and women. And yes, that's the question, do we want to replicate this, or do we want to rebel against it? And speaking about that, there are 2 very successful models of journalism, both owned, created, and headed by women, Mada Masr website and Al Manassa. They're both very creative websites. It's a completely different working environment. you know, the websites are very different. We're going to speak about that tomorrow. And they're both owned by women editor-in-chief, women editors. And yeah, I agree with you completely.
Is reform possible from within, or are we looking at the only possibility as disruption?
I think it definitely things needs to change, and they started to change a little bit with setbacks or something. But you know, I want to draw to your attention to things happening in our region, and that will affect the media and all other sectors. You know, after the Arab Springs and all the wars in the region, wars change lives. And you can see with ISIS and Daesh, with all what happened. There was one picture in Raqqa when they were liberated from Daesh, ISIS, and you know the reaction immediately. They took off the veil and, you know, putting all the colors, the robes with colors, in contrast with all the black chadors that they were forced them to wear. This is one thing. And the other, you know, there are lots of displacements in our part of the world, especially Syria, Iraq, and that. And do you think that women who were displaced, Syrian women who were displaced from Syria and came to Lebanon, or to Egypt, or to Turkey, or whatever, and they will go back again to their villages, but they changed. There are no more the women who were staying in their own Syrian villages with all. They were exposed to something else. What I want to say that all these changes, we have changes coming, you know, we are going through all these changes in our part of the world, and that will affect the mentality. Sometimes we'll have setbacks with suppression and oppression, but there are things and new things coming. I don't know what will happen, how they will be developing. And this, I think, that will affect all of us as journalists also. And the idea that I want to say, if we prove that you are qualified, the most important, how you can prove yourself, if you are successful or not, whether you are a man or a woman, definitely you need to have equal laws, okay, and try to apply them one by one. It's not going to happen overnight. With training, with a good example that I can do the job properly. I think this will make a difference with changing the mentality and having all this. So it's a long way.
Myra, any final thoughts on change?
No, but I wanted to say something about destruction. As tempting as it may sound, not really with destruction, because the alternative is not powerful enough yet.
So not the time yet, possibly. Please join me in thanking our panelists today, Dalal, Lina, and Myra. Thank you so much for your inputs, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone.